Thank you all so much for joining us for the Strategies for Graduate Success Applying to and Thriving in Grad School workshop. Joining us today are Dr. Andrew Hansen, Dean of the Honors College, Andrea Corral Rodriguez, Masters of Social Work student and Gradable Ambassador, Joseph Kim, Master of Hotel Administration student and Gradable Ambassador. So we're going to start off with Dr. Hansen discussing about how to best transition from being an undergraduate student to going into grad school and how to excel once you're there. After his presentation, we're going to open it up to a Q&A with the audience so you can ask Dr. Hansen and our Gradable Ambassadors question and get some perspective from current graduate students. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Hansen to get us started. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Nevada. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this workshop on learning more about the process of transitioning from being an undergraduate student to a graduate student. For many people, going on to graduate school is the culmination of a long path. And in my case, going to graduate school was absolutely the best thing that could have happened to me academically. And so I want to share some of that knowledge and information and tell you about some of the inside workings of that process that happens as you're going through the transition from being an undergraduate to being a grad student. All right, so let's get started and move ahead to the next slide. And for some reason, oh, I know why, my cursor was in the wrong place. All right, so we have a cartoon here for you. I'm going to stop talking for a little bit, and I'd like each of you to read the cartoon. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to read that cartoon. A little bit of humor to introduce the idea that like graduate school comes with certain challenges, and you know, it might be something that you, along with most other people, sort of agonize over whether you're doing that is the right thing for you or not. But we've got some other reasons about why go to graduate school. So for all graduate programs, that when you embark on something like that, you're going on an advanced study beyond what you do as an undergraduate. There's a whole variety of different kinds of things that can happen once you go into the graduate realm. For some students, that means they'll earn graduate certificates that are specialized, short limited things that you learn about a specific thing. For most students, historically, that either means going on and getting a master's degree or going into a doctoral degree. And there are different kinds of master's degrees and doctoral degrees. So in many cases, those are research degrees where you do a research project and write a thesis or write a dissertation. But not all of them are like that. Some master's programs don't require a thesis. So there's a wide variety of things out there, and you should investigate and figure out what is the best thing for what you're trying to do. For all of them, you get to really delve into your subject area in much greater depth and develop expertise in a particular thing, and oftentimes with a particular specialization. One thing that's different about graduate school compared to your time as an undergrad is that graduate school is built on what we call a mentorship model of learning, where you work with a specific faculty member as your thesis advisor or dissertation advisor, and you work with that person because they are an expert in the topic that you're interested in. And so you work with them. They are your mentor for your time as a student. And also, it's different than being an undergraduate in the sense that a key part of what you will do, particularly if you are in a research graduate program, is instead of learning content like you oftentimes do in undergraduate classes, you'll actually be the person creating new knowledge, creating new information. And so that's really a key difference between being an undergraduate where you're taking classes and learning material that for the most part we already know how something works, what the answers are, to going into something where you get to pose the questions and figure out how to derive new knowledge and create that new knowledge. So other things to consider is, like I've talked a bit about the different kinds of things, different kinds of degrees. Bachelor's degrees are typically where you will gain a lot of technical knowledge and gain expertise in a particular field. but it won't necessarily be concentrated into a specific focus that is really detailed and specific. For students who go on and get master's degrees, for certain industries, that is actually considered the entry-level degree. And if you want to go on into academia, if you want to be a professor at a university beyond a community college, then you're going to need a PhD to do that. There are a number of governmental research positions that require that someone have a PhD to be able to be qualified for those positions. And other research jobs outside of government also may require that PhD. A key thing for all of these degrees that we're talking about is the last bullet point here. As you move from the bachelor's to the master's and into the PhD, one of the great things about going down that path is you will have more decision making, more control, and you can have more opportunities to advance and really control your career. So I'm going to pause for just a second and tell you a bit about my background. I have a bachelor's degree in nursing from Montana State University. I ended up in that degree really as kind of a fluke, and then I worked as an operating room nurse for about 8 years. And I realized it wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't where my passion lay. And I went back to school as a graduate student, but a non-degree seeking graduate student to explore some other opportunities. And I took a geology class, and I realized, like, this is where I should have been all along. So I completed the undergraduate requirements for a geology student at the school I was attending, and then went straight into their master's program, and then went on and got a PhD. I worked briefly for an oil company in Texas, and in that role, there were a few people who worked for the company in geoscience who had bachelor's degrees, but those people really didn't have control over their day-to-day work, other than the fact that they were given projects to do that needed technical expertise, but they weren't making any decisions. They weren't really the people driving the business forward. They were simply providing technical expertise to complete tasks. And the majority of the people in that industry were people who had a master's degree. So it was considered the entry-level degree for a professional in that particular field. And then for me, as a student who had a PhD, when I went into the industry, my PhD gave me a wide breadth of knowledge, but it also gave me a specialization in a particular thing that was of value to people in that industry. And so really that's, I think, sort of illustrates sort of the range of different things that can happen as you're progressing through these different degrees and how that influences what you'll do. Obviously, in each of these, you would qualify for a higher salary as you go through it, but I think more important, at least from my standpoint, was being able to have control over what I got to do and how I got to impact the work of that organization that I was part of. All right, so other reasons you might consider going to graduate school. Well, if you're not done thinking, learning, and asking questions, then this is a way for you to continue to keep gaining knowledge and creating knowledge. Most people who go to graduate school like challenges and they like earning accomplishments. If you want more career and professional options and more control over your career and your profession, then going to graduate school is typically a really smart thing. If you're thinking about finances, then in almost all cases, if not all, it's a strategic decision that you make that influences the finances, and we'll talk about that a bit on the next slide or two. And if you know that advanced degree correlates positively with other significant life outcomes for you and your family, then you may want to embark on that. If you want to make an impact, and I think the example I gave of my experience in the oil industry illustrates that, you'll have more control and more influence over what happens when you go on and get those advanced degrees. And then if you're like most people who go to graduate school, you're just driven by curiosity and you want to go learn new things, and it's an honor to do that. I referred to the fact that that a bachelor's degree is great, but going on to a graduate degree is typically financially a savvy thing to do. You can see that 32% of Americans each year get a bachelor's. only 13% of Americans have masters, and only about 2 to 2.5% of the American population have doctorates. So you really are distinguishing yourself and becoming much more of a rare bird as you go up that ladder. Now, you can see that unfortunately there's a discrepancy between what the impact that this has on men's and their earning powers compared to women's, and that's obviously a problem that we all know about. We all know that women doing similar kind of work are not compensated in the same way. But it's still important to note that men with bachelor's degrees earn close to $1 million more in median lifetime earnings than students who just have a high school degree. And unfortunately, that number is smaller for women, but it still will have a significant financial impact. And then men with graduate degrees will earn $1.5 million more in their lifetime earnings compared to a high school student, and women will earn $1.1 million more. So it will cost you a bit to spend time getting those degrees, but overall, then you will have a higher base salary as you go on into your career, and you'll make that up. All right, so let's talk about when you would want to apply. So for many applications, the deadline will vary. The majority of students start graduate school in the fall, but it's not an essential thing. It's not mandated that you start in the fall. I mean, there are some programs that will admit students to start in spring or even in the summertime. So one of the things you'll find, if you haven't already discovered this as you're thinking about graduate school, is that there's a lot of different things to keep track of. And so we always advocate for starting a spreadsheet where you list the schools that you're considering or that you're starting to apply to, and keep track of all the different things that they require, because there's a whole lot of pieces to applying to graduate school. So you're going to want to start a spreadsheet and have a column or a row for each school you're considering. And then you're going to need to go to those schools' websites and figure out what are their requirements. There's a lot to sort of juggle and keep on top of. Keep in mind that when you apply to a graduate program, the graduate college at the school that you're applying to will have a certain set of requirements that you need to complete. But each of the departments that you're applying to might have a separate set of requirements that they require. And sometimes those will all be listed in a nice, convenient single place. But in many cases, you'll need to look at what's the graduate college require of you and what does the department require of you. Some of the fall deadlines can come as early as December of the year before. So in other words, if you're wanting to apply to a graduate program that starts this coming August or September, if you haven't already applied and that school has a December deadline or that program has a December deadline, you're going to have to wait until the following application cycle. So some of those deadlines will come pretty early. The majority of them are due about this time of the year, though. So most graduate degree programs have deadlines for applying that are in this February, March timeline for starting in fall semester. One of the things that you all should do if you are citizens is not just apply, but also do the FAFSA. If you're a non-US citizen, you wouldn't be eligible for financial aid that's distributed through the FAFSA, but there may be other funding sources that I think I'll talk about more in a later slide. But you should apply for those things, even if you don't think you're going to require financial assistance. Nobody would turn money away that's just given to you freely, and sometimes that happens, but in order to do that, you will have had to have either submitted the FAFSA or some alternate form that the particular school you're applying to has in place. Okay, other things to keep track of are every school that you're gonna, and every department that you're gonna apply to is gonna require transcripts of your undergraduate classes thus far. And if you've taken classes at other places besides UNLV, you're probably gonna need to track those down and submit those. And if you've taken any graduate classes anywhere, those would be asked for as well. Something to keep in mind is that universities may ask for either official transcripts or unofficial transcripts. If you are offered admission, you will have to submit an official transcript before you begin your graduate studies. But if they only require an unofficial transcript at the time that you're applying, then do that, because it won't cost you anything to submit an unofficial transcript, whereas you will have to pay a fee to have an official transcript sent to the school that you're applying to. And they will, as I said, they'll want it for all of the graduate level, or all of the post high school, university, college, community college type classes that you've taken. And they'll use that to evaluate whether you meet their stated requirements. I'm going to pause for just a second and talk about that. My PhD program had a minimum GPA requirement. I believe it was a 3.25 or a 3.3. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's been many decades ago. But I know from having applied, been accepted, and going there, that the people in the department office, the staff members, were the people who received all the application material. And the first thing that they would do is they would look at the student's GPA who was applying. And if the student didn't meet the minimum requirement, those applications were just, that was the end of the road for them. They didn't get reviewed. Nothing else happened with them other than they got filed in the reject files. So make sure you know what their minimum requirements are if they have something like that. And if you don't meet it, then don't waste your time and energy doing an application for that program. Every graduate program is going to require that you have people who write letters of recommendation for you. So you want to think about who are going to be the people who can best write letters for you. So there's several things I want to say here. You want to plan ahead. You want to figure out who you can ask. You want to contact those people and ask them if they're willing and able to write a letter for you. And you want to give them plenty of time to do that. Don't go to them 2 days before the deadline and say, hey, I would like you to write a letter of recommendation for me, because your bad planning is probably going to make them not happy. And you don't want that person unhappy with you at the time that they're writing a letter for you. One other thing that I always like to talk about is this point about, should you waive your rights to review the letter? So in almost every case I'm aware of, when you fill out the materials for the graduate college, there will be a form that's used that will solicit the letter of recommendation from whoever you name. And one part of that form will ask you, do you want to waive your rights to review the letter that's submitted on your behalf or not? And in the United States, you have a legal right to see the materials that are submitted on your behalf when you apply to graduate school. So if you want, you can say, I do not want to waive my rights, and that would allow you to then ask for the letters that are submitted on your behalf, and you could see them. But you won't get to do that until after you've already been admitted into that graduate program. So I actually recommend that you waive your rights to review the letters that are submitted for you. And that might sound counterintuitive, but here's why I make that recommendation. There have been instances, unfortunately, in the past where a letter writer wrote a letter that maybe had something in it that a student then later read that letter, and they felt like that there was something about that letter that they didn't agree with, and that they felt like that there was some negative outcome from that. And they've sued the person who wrote the letter. And in some cases, that suit has been successful. So one of the things that happens is faculty and other people who write letters know that there is a bit of a risk if they say something negative about a student in a letter of recommendation. So they may choose not to include something negative because they know that there's always that possibility out there if in fact the student could potentially see that letter in the future. So as a reviewer, when you're reviewing two applicants and one of the students has waived their right and the other one has not, let's imagine that that's the scenario, that you're the reviewer and you're evaluating these two applicants and both of them have glowing letters of recommendation. Well, if you know that the student waived their right, you know that there's no reason for that person not to fully share their opinion of that student. In other words, that person knew that the student would never see that letter, and there's nothing negative in that letter. And so the reviewer will review that letter and go, I think that this student is a great student based on this letter. Then they read the application from the student who did not waive their right. and they again see a glowing letter. But there's always a seed of doubt in the reviewer's mind about whether the letter writer fully disclosed everything that they wanted to say, or whether they maybe held back and didn't share some information that's maybe less than positive. So the people you're going to ask to write letters are people who know you, who you've done good things with, and almost universally, they're going to write glowing positive things about you. So that's why my recommendation is go ahead and waive your right to review materials. Then the person who's reading your letter's recommendation will have full faith that the great things that are being said in your letters are true and that there's nothing more that the letter writer wanted to share. Okay, so another key part of what you'll need to do when you're applying to graduate school is to think about and plan for and submit any standardized test requirements that are required for the program. In the past, the GRE, the Graduate Record Exam, was a very common exam that students who wanted to go to graduate school would have to take and submit. That's becoming less and less common. The LSAT is the exam that anybody wanting to go to law school has to take, and the MCAT is the exam that anybody wanting to go to med school has to take. So if you're planning on going into those paths, you want to make sure that you know what the requirements are in that regard and what the timelines are for those. And also keep in mind that you're going to pay a fee in order to do those standardized tests. So figure in the timing, the deadlines, and the cost of those. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we advocate having a spreadsheet where you keep track of all these things. If you're an international student, then there's some other things that will come into play. So if you attended a university in a country where English is not the language of instruction, then you'll have to submit a test that illustrates that you have sufficient mastery of English in order to be able to be successful coming to the US and being in the graduate program at the school you're applying to. And also, if your transcript is not in English, you will have to submit that for review with an external company who will charge a fee to translate your transcript from whatever your native language is into English, because the graduate college won't do that. And so if you submitted a transcript that was in some language other than English, you're probably going to get rejected because they don't have a way of independently evaluating what your transcript actually says. Okay, other things to keep in mind is every application for graduate school will almost certainly have an application fee. If you're a domestic student at UNLV, that fee is $60. If you're an international student, that's $95. And so one of the things to keep in mind is we've talked about several things already that have a cost associated with them. So keep in mind that the more schools you apply to, the more your costs are going to go up. And so a key question is like, well, how many schools should I apply to? And so I think the best way to decide how many schools you should apply to is to talk to faculty members in your particular discipline. In some disciplines, it is common for the students to apply to, say, a maximum of maybe 4 schools. In other disciplines, it's much more common for a student to apply to, say, 10 or 15 schools. So figure out what the norm is within your discipline and then go for that and use that information. You want to also think about having a range of schools that you're going to apply to. So one of the tips that sometimes people will share is that you should apply to the schools where you are, at least one school where you are assured that you're going to be offered admission. You also want to apply to a number of schools where you feel like those would be great schools for me to go to, and that you should apply to at least one of your reach schools. In other words, it would be fantastic, but maybe it's out of my league, but I'm going to have at least one school that, like, if I got in there, that would be awesome. And so have a strategy for which you apply to. Now, I will share an inside story about why I think that's generally good advice, but not necessarily always great advice. So before I became the Dean of the Honors College, I was a faculty member in the Geoscience Department here at UNLV. And each department at UNLV has a faculty member in the faculty who serves as what we call the graduate coordinator. That's the person in the department who oversees all the graduate applications, the graduate admission decisions, how the financial awards are distributed to the students who we're bringing in on assistantships and all those sorts of things. So that person is really an important person within each department that you're applying to. So there was one year when I was the graduate coordinator where we had an applicant from a well-recognized undergraduate institution who is applying to our graduate program. And that particular application cycle, the department didn't have a lot of financial assistance to be able to offer to the students in our applicant pool. And in my particular discipline, if you're not able to support a student financially, historically, we would only offer admission to the students who we could support with an assistantship because that's the norm. And so in this case, we didn't have very many assistantships. We had a very competitive pool. And so this particular student who applied, we ended up rejecting, not because he was not a great student, but because we just didn't have financial support for him. That particular student also applied and was accepted to the graduate program at Stanford University that particular year. And so I always thought, how ironic that this student who was applying to UNLV, which maybe was considered his safety school, didn't get an offer from us, but he applied to Stanford, which maybe was his reach university, and he got admitted there. So the moral of the story is there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes that you don't have any control over, and you just have to decide what's an appropriate number of schools to apply for, and make sure you have something that if you got in there, and maybe it's a stretch to apply there, but it would be a great thing, don't eliminate those possible great opportunities because they might work out for you. All right, I already mentioned, I think it's great advice to talk to the professors in your current department and ask them not just about programs and universities that you might want to apply to, but who you might want to work with. So, and sort of hidden in that is who you might want to avoid working with. So I'll use another example from my time in Geo. There's a faculty member at another university, I'm not going to name the school, but who's an incredibly well-known person within my subdiscipline of geoscience. And so sometimes I would get UNLV undergraduates asking me like, Dr. Hansen, I want to go into the kind of geology that you and I are both interested in. Which schools do you think I should go to? And like, I'm thinking about applying at this school to work with this professor. And there's something that is underlying what I'm going to share next. And that is typically faculty members are hesitant to sort of badmouth any of their colleagues, even if they're at other schools. It's a tight-knit community that you're entering into. And so if you start badmouthing somebody, oftentimes that word is going to get back to the person who you've said negative things about. So you tend not to say those things. So if a student came to me and said, I want to work with Professor X at that school, and I know that that's not a good decision, I might say things like, well, I wouldn't apply to work with them. Instead, I think this person at this school might be a better choice for you. If a faculty member says that to you, they're trying to steer you away from something that's potentially a problem. And so like that, in this particular example, I knew that faculty member at that school had a bad reputation of not working with female students in ways that were entirely appropriate. And so if a female student said, hey, I'm thinking about going to that school to work with so-and-so, that's the kind of person I'd say, well, have you thought about working with so-and-so at that school instead, or this person at this school instead? And so if somebody says that kind of thing to you, pay attention to it. It's a red flag that they're not going to explicitly tell you why you shouldn't work with that person, but there's something that's causing them to not to suggest you go elsewhere. Now, it may not be something as egregious as what I was just describing. It may be something to the effect of that, like, that person at that school that the student is considering going to only admits PhD or postdocs to work with them. And if the student is saying, I want to go on and get a master's degree, and it would be great if I could work with them, I would tell that student, well, if that's what you want to do, don't go to that school with that faculty member, because I know that they don't admit master's students. They only take PhD and postdocs. So pay attention to what your current professors tell you about who to work with and maybe some hints about who to avoid. Now, in addition to that, key to who you're going to say you want to work with when you apply to those things is, well, what do the faculty members at those schools do? And first and foremost in your decision making should be, do your research interests match the research interests of the faculty member who you're saying you want to work with at that school? Other things that you might consider is like, how successful has that faculty member's former and current students, graduate students, been? Do those students have funding? Are they, when they are finishing their work, are they getting publications out? And where did those past advisees go now? If none of the graduate students of a particular person you're considering have gone successfully into the career path that you want to go into, then you might want to think about, like, well, is there somebody else who's more successful at launching the careers of their advisees that want to go on to a particular path? Another thing to think about is to talk to the current advisees of the faculty member that you're considering. Are those people happy? Do they have good funding? What's the normative time that it takes for a student in that university and that department to finish their degree time? If there's 2 universities and in one, PhD students typically finish in 3 to 4 years, and in the other university, if all else is equal, but that takes the students at the second place 6 or 7 years to get the same degree, choose the one where you're going to get done in a faster time and can move on into your career and start being more financially secure. That's if all else is equal. So those are just some things to think about. Okay, I alluded to this before, but a key difference between most graduate programs and undergraduate is that research aspect. So it's really important when you're applying to these sorts of research degrees that you have an idea of what you want to work on. As it says here, it doesn't have to be super specific, but you need to be able to articulate what it is you're hoping to do when you go into that department and what you want to work on. And the department needs to know that, because what they will do is they will look at the pool of applicants they have and go, okay, this student is in specialization A, this one is in specialization B. Who do we have on the faculty that we would match those applicants to? Then the next thing the graduate coordinator is going to do is go to that individual faculty members and say, hey, we've got 5 great applicants who want to do the kind of work that you do. How many are you willing to admit any of them? And if so, how many? And if the person who is maybe the only person in that department who has that subspecialty says, I can't take any more students, I've already got too many, I'm not taking any new students, well, then that department is going to reject you, not because you're not a great student, but because they don't have a space to put you when you would be arriving. So a smart thing to do is for you to reach out to the faculty member who does the kind of thing you're interested in and ask them, would you be able and willing to admit new advisees in the fall when I'm hoping to come there? And it's totally appropriate to also ask them, and this will vary depending on your discipline and how much external resources are available for students in your discipline, but to ask them if they have any funded projects that they're looking for students to work on. So those are things that are entirely appropriate, but very few students actually take that step and reach out to the prospective advisor and ask them those questions. I remember a student applying to our department saying, I want to do a project in such and such a subspecialty. And we didn't even have anybody who did that in our department. So that student got a rejection. And I always looked at those kind of applications and thought, why didn't the student do their homework? They could have known that they weren't going to get an offer because we don't do the kind of thing that they're interested in doing. Another thing to think about is, where is your prospective advisor with regards to their career? If there's somebody who's a brand new faculty member, they might be really gung-ho and be somebody who is just coming right out of a PhD program and has landed a faculty position. It might be off to a great career. But in that scenario, that person probably hasn't even had time yet to write a grant proposal, much less secure grant funding. And so if they're going to be able to admit you, it's probably going to be on an assistantship, which I'll talk about more in a bit. But that might not be as advantageous to you as if the faculty member already has a grant that includes funding for you and that they want to pay you to work on a project for them. And in that case, you might be working on your thesis or dissertation project and not having to be a teaching assistant, for example. So look at where the mentor is in their career. A person who's been around a lot longer and who has a really great record is somebody that prospective schools are more likely to look at, like, oh, this person who's applying for an assistant professor in our position came from this school working with that person. We know that great students come out of that. So that person who's been there longer might have a reputation that is very different than the brand new faculty member. Now, all things considered, if the brand new faculty member is a hotshot that's doing something new and creative and it's going to be the next best thing, maybe that's way better than the person who's been around for a long time. But when you apply, you're going to have to write a personal statement. And so in that personal statement, you want to spell out what your interests are, both generally and specifically. So I think a great personal statement is one that will say, this is where I'm coming from. This is the kinds of things I've been doing. I have an interest in this particular thing, and I want to go on and get this degree. And I could see myself working on a project in this subdiscipline related to this thing. You don't have to be down to the nitty-gritty specific, but again, the department graduate coordinator is going to want to know, if we admit this student, who are they going to work with, and is there a space for that person here? If you're not able to define a specific area of interest, I think that's a major red flag. And when that's happened and I was a graduate coordinator, we would reject those kind of applications. And I can remember one distinctly where a student who had a good undergraduate record applied and said, you know, I loved every one of my geology classes as an undergraduate, and I could see myself doing a graduate degree in any area within geology. Well, we automatically rejected that application because we're like, well, this student is a decent student, but they don't know where they're trying to go. They don't know what they want to work on. And so how do we possibly assign them to a particular faculty member where they're expected to specialize? Now that will vary from discipline to discipline. So that's not that what I just described is not always true, but I wanted you to be aware of that. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about, okay, you've gone through the decision making. I want to go to grad school. You've looked at the timelines, you've looked at the requirements, and now you've applied. And the next big thing to think about is like, well, how are you going to fund this whole graduate endeavor? So for many graduate students, the most common form of financial support is what we call a graduate assistantship. And I'll talk about that more on the next slide. We'll spend a bit of time talking about that. But there are other things that can be really valuable when you're considering going on to graduate school from the funding standpoint. So it's a bit rare, but there are certain corporations or foundations that will give scholarships to students who fit certain criteria. So I'll go back to an example from my time in Geo. We had a Latina student in Geo who wanted to work for an oil company, and they wanted to increase the diversity of their workforce, and having a female Latina student was something that they found appealing. And so they made an offer to that student and said, we will support you while you're a graduate student if you'll come and work for us once you've completed your degree. So there are things like that, but those are not common. There's a whole nother set of things that we call nationally competitive awards, which are scholarships, fellowships, whatever you want to call them. But in all cases, they are things that you apply for. They're super competitive, so they're really hard to get. But if you get them, they provide great funding for you while you're a graduate student. So if you're in the STEM disciplines and you've got a good record, you should be applying for what's called the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program. The success rate, as you can see, is not that high, but 15% is a whole lot better than the next level down, which shows that the Rhodes, Marshall, and Mitchell are all about 2% success rates. But there's a variety of different these kinds of things that are out there. And so, but you have to be an exceptional student with a great record to really be competitive for most of those. And so if those are things that you're interested in, there's lots of information out there on those. Another thing to think about is, what is it going to cost you to live in the place in which you are going to graduate school? So, and I said we're going to talk about assistantships here in a little bit, but let's say two schools offer you similar financial assistantships. But one school is at UCLA and the cost of living in Los Angeles versus the other one, which is at the University of Montana. And so the cost of living in Missoula, Montana is a fraction of what it is to live in UCLA. So even though those two offers might look similar financially, they're not comparable. So think about it, what it's going to cost you to live in the place where you want to go. You can also think about, whether you have any personal financial things that you can add to that, and what sort of financial aid might be available. I already talked about the FAFSA. If you're a U.S. citizen, apply for the FAFSA. If you're not, ask if there's an alternate needs application process that might be able to give you similar kinds of funding. All right, so now let's talk about graduate assistantships more specifically. So generally, graduate students are funded, especially doctoral students. But there are sort of two broad types of assistantships. There's a TA or an RA, that stands for a teaching assistantship or a research assistantship. Clearly, those will have different responsibilities, but for both of them, the student is paid a stipend in exchange for work, and it pays for either some or all of your costs. So I will give the example of when I was a PhD student. So I was given a full assistantship, and my assistantship was to be a teaching assistantship. So that meant that I spent a certain amount of time each week teaching intro geology labs to undergraduate students. And in exchange for that, I got a stipend that was a check that went into my personal banking account that I could use to pay whatever I chose to. But of course, I used that to pay my rent, my car, my gas, the groceries, all those sorts of things. And it paid me not a lot, but it paid me enough that I could support myself. And also part of that assistantship was that then the university didn't charge me tuition fees. And so I basically had a free ride. So that's what we're talking about if you're a teaching assistantship. If you're hired as a research assistantship, that means that there's some grant funding that was specifically set aside by a faculty member to support a student to work on a research project. So if you have an assistantship, you'll either be teaching or doing research, or in some cases, you might be given other duties that are appropriate for where you're trying to go career-wise, but aren't really teaching or research. In many disciplines, if you're offered admission without support, you really want to think about whether you should accept those offers or not. In most cases, well, in many cases, particularly in the STEM fields, if there's no offer of support, it typically means that you should really seriously think about whether you want to go there. And usually students would be declined, or the student would decline the offer. In other disciplines, though, it's a very different story. So sometimes students will decline, and in others, they might accept if they're going on to a professional master's and other certain situations. A GA is great, so a graduate assistantship, whether it's teaching or RA, but you want to look at what is being offered and what's entailed in that GA, and recognize that not all GAs are equal. So you want to ask questions like, what does the GA cover? How much is the financial amount? What are the responsibilities that I would have if I was to accept your offer and was supported on this GA? At the school that I did my PhD, I was required as part of my agreement to get the assistantship to teach one geology lab that had a cap and enrollment in the class of 20 students. At another school that I was offered admission to, they said, we think you're great. We'd love you to come here. We're going to offer you a teaching assistantship, and you'll teach 3 sections of intro geology, and each one of the sections is capped at 25 students. So those 2 teaching assistants were not even close to being comparable. So you want to ask questions and make sure you understand what the offer is above and beyond just what the dollar amount is. Another thing to ask is if they offer you funding, how long can I count on that funding? In some cases, I might say, given successful progress, as a master's student, we'll fund you for 2 years. If it takes longer than that, you might have to find funding on your own for the last bit. Sometimes we might be able to offer more. If you're a PhD student, you might get an offer that says, assuming successful progress, we'll commit to funding you for 4 years. But in other cases, it might be less than that. So just make sure you understand what's being offered and what the different pros and cons of those are. And then ask if there's other scholarships or fellowships that are internal at that school that you're going to, and whether you might be eligible to secure some funding through that. All right, there's a number of red flags that a reviewer who's reviewing your application might note. So if you delayed or got low grades in core classes, that can be a red flag. And I'll give you an example. In my discipline, a lot of students love geology classes, but they suffer from fundamental math skills. They have to take a calculus class. Ideally, they should be taking the calculus class their freshman year because it'll help them through the sequence of classes that comes next. But oftentimes it's not required that the student take it then. And so a lot of students wait until their final semester to take calculus. That's a signal to the reviewer that like this student really maybe doesn't have the great math skills that you would hope. And so don't delay or get low grades in core classes that are really important for the major. If you had to repeat a number of classes, or you consistently withdrew from the same classes, or you just have a low GPA overall, those are all things that will be red flags. If you are required to do the GRE score and you have low scores, that can be a red flag. You want to take time and make sure you write your personal statement well. Spend the time and energy to write a really quality statement that spells out the kinds of things that I articulated before. If you make typos, if you have grammar mistakes, or if you don't really say what it is you're trying to do, those are all things that are less likely to produce a positive result for you. Another thing that a reviewer might look at is whether there's any evidence that you have low self-esteem or that you lack confidence. People who are going to go on to graduate school are expected to be leaders and to take a role like creating new knowledge and sharing that to society. And so if you're the kind of person who's so incredibly shy that you can't communicate to people in a verbal form, then that's a potential problem. Another thing that oftentimes surprises people is that great graduate students are oftentimes people who are really creative. And so if you lack creative skills, that's a bit of a concern. The reason that matters is you're trying to create new knowledge and you go into it with certain ideas. And when something doesn't work the way you expect, which oftentimes happens in research endeavors, a creative person will step back and go, okay, something just happened here. What was it? Maybe it was this thing. And now we should try this other alternate way of thinking and approaching and trying to come to a conclusion. Some people are great at that. Others not so much, but that's an important part of the research process, is being able to be creative and think through problems that you're going to encounter. Other mistakes that sometimes happen are that the letters of recommendation just aren't that strong, or the letters are from people who really can't comment on the student's research skills. If you're applying for a research degree, you want letters from people who can talk about any research experience you already have. So for the most part, I would advocate that you get letters from faculty members who know about your academic endeavors and ideally about your research skills. This is probably not the place to get a letter from a pastor or a manager at a non-university job. Sometimes those letters can be useful in that they might speak to your discipline, your commitment to things, your dependability, those sorts of things. But if you have a great record with faculty members who can talk about all those things and talk about how gifted you are at doing research, those are the best kind of letters. We've talked about not articulating who your presumed advisor would be and why that's problematic. If you're unable to state a focused interest, that's a problem. Don't submit bad personal statements if you're unprofessional or unprepared for an interview, which is not required for all graduate programs, but for some, an interview is part of the process. So make sure that you have those kinds of skills and practice those skills if you don't. Some students have too many other responsibilities or distractions, and that can lead to problems. So good things to have are the things listed here. If you've already done research and you're applying to do more of it, that's a really reassuring thing to the person who's considering your application. If your passion for the discipline that you're in comes through, that's a great thing. But don't say you have a passion for that thing. Instead, give the reader lots of evidence that makes them go, ah, this student clearly has a passion for our discipline. We should admit that. We already talked about being creative. Being curious and scholarly is super important because people who are curious are the kinds who are like, there's something really interesting about this field that I'm in, and there are things that we don't understand, and like I really want to figure out what those things are. If that's you, you should be considering graduate school. You're going to have to be a self-starter and a problem solver. Unlike undergraduate, where you're given a syllabus at the start of the semester and it has deadlines and requirements for a number of different things, when you're working on a research project, you sort of have to figure out a lot of that on your own and figure out how to get going on the project and how to solve problems as they come up. Obviously, if you're hardworking, mature, reliable, professional, those are all great things. And having good time management skills is super important. Again, this is another thing where you won't be given the same set of specific deadlines and timelines, but you're going to have to self-impose those and figure out how to come up with a plan and how to manage your time successfully. All right, other things are if you've done research work as an undergrad and did a great job, that's great. If your letters come from respected people that are known in the community, that will enhance how well they're perceived. A letter from a member of the American Academy of Science will always trump your troop leader's letter every single time. If you have a choice between somebody who's an assistant professor, an associate professor, and a full professor, going back to what I referred to early on, the person who's the full professor will be able to compare you to a whole group of people and say, you know, this student is in the top 5% of all the students I've ever worked with. That carries more weight than somebody who's a brand new assistant professor who says, this is a great student and is in the top 5%. That's not, those two things aren't comparable. Being able to synthesize information, not just memorize material and for lack of better words, regurgitate it back on an exam or in a paper is really important when you're doing research. Having a strong academic record means that you've got the skills that are going to be important when you've gone into that graduate program. You also want to be the kind of person who works well with others. Most research, particularly in STEM fields, not so much in other disciplines, but in STEM fields, most research today is done in teams. So the person who's going to be admitting you to work with that team is going to want to know, are you professional? Are you a good colleague? Do you get along with people? And then super important for every graduate program, I think, having good communication skills, both in the oral and written format, are essential things. So let's wrap this up and then we'll turn it over to our students and we'll have them talk a bit. There's lots of good reasons to go to grad school. And hopefully that's come out in the different things that I've shared. So key, you want to do well as an undergrad, take advantage of opportunities, and start building your academic network. Figure out what it is you like, and then confidently pursue it. Obviously, there's a lot to figure out as you're making that transition from undergraduate to graduate, so plan, build a spreadsheet, determine deadlines, make requests with good lead time, prepare yourself with the skills you'll need, and then at the end of the day, you just got to go for it and do the best possible applications you have, and hopefully you'll have great outcomes from that. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and we will turn it over to our two students who are here from the Grad Rebel program. And Nevena, do you want to introduce Andrea and Joseph?
Yeah, thank you so much for such an informative presentation, Dr. Hansen. I'm going to ask Andrea and Joseph to turn on their cameras now and come to the stage with Dr. Hansen. And then I'm going to hand it over to you all to tell us a little bit about yourself, what program you're in, just a little bit about your journey to graduate school. And then we're going to go ahead and address the questions that are in the chat and that come throughout this Q&A portion. So Andrea, I'll let you get started.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrea. I'm the Masters of Social Work program here at UNLV in my last semester, and my trajectory for graduate studies has been somewhat not very traditional, but that has been a wonderful thing of just helping me gather more research experience and also learning what it is that I wanted to get out of grad school and just be more intentional in my endeavors.
Thank you, Andrea. Joseph, can you introduce yourself?
I think he's muted.
You're muted, Joseph.
Oh, oh, sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph. I'm an international student. I'm from Singapore. I'm currently pursuing my master's, dual master's in hospitality and another in management information systems. Yeah. And I'm also a graduate assistant with UNLV Career Services at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And as you can all see, both Joseph and Andrea have a really unique perspective based on their backgrounds and the way they got their journeys to graduate school. So please feel free to ask them any questions you might have regarding their journey or just their time right now as graduate students at UNLV. You can go ahead and type your questions in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. But it looks like we do have a question though that goes back to the presentation, so I'll go ahead and address that. So someone asked, what if you went to two different schools? Would it go by the average GPA from both schools? And maybe Dr. Hanson, you can address that.
Yeah, so you're almost certainly gonna be asked to report both of those GPAs. I wouldn't just take the GPA from one school and the GPA from the other school, add them together and divide by 2. There's a way that you can actually calculate a true GPA based upon how it, and the reason you wouldn't do what I suggested is like maybe you only took 2 classes at one school and you did really well, and you took a whole bunch at another school, and maybe those weren't so great. If you average those 2, you're going to get a number that's not really an average of your overall academic record. The advisors at UNLV are outstanding, and they have programs that they can do these kind of GPA calculations just like a click of a button, basically. So there's lots of ways that you can do that. But and also the other thing I'd say is, every application that you do is potentially going to ask for the information in different ways. And so there might be one that's asked you to report all the schools you went to and what your GPA was from that and how many credits you had from that. There's another one that might just ask, what was your undergraduate GPA? So the way in which you input information is going to be controlled to a certain extent by what the grad college at that school requires.
Thank you. So I got a question in the chat that is geared to the grad level ambassadors, and the first one is, what do you think is the biggest difference between graduate school and undergrad?
I can go ahead. So I did my undergrad in UNLV as well. So I think I can compare both since being in UNLV right now too as a graduate student. I think also Dr. Hanson also mentioned about what the difference is. And I think obviously undergrad, you learn more technical skills and the skills required in the field where you go to as an undergrad. And when you go up to the master's level, you're learning more on the upper management skills and leadership skills necessary to navigate whichever industry you're at. So I think that would be the biggest difference.
Thank you, Joseph. And Joseph comes to us from more of a professional program as well, with hospitality. So he has a bit of both of those perspectives. Andrea, do you have anything to add?
So I think Joseph made a great point with the difference between undergrad and grad, and based on that question of like the different funding opportunities, I think they're all great in and of itself, having that financial support, and it just depends on what it is that you're looking for in graduate school. So if you're geared more toward academia and that sort of a thing, perhaps a teaching assistantship or a research assistantship might be better.
I'm going to chime in here on something I never really thought of before that's a difference between undergrad and grad, and that is in undergraduate, if you're a student in the US, you're going to be taking the liberal arts model of undergraduate education, where you're going to be required to take a variety of classes across many disciplines. When you get into graduate school, that will go away and you will be taking classes exclusively within your particular disciplinary field. So you won't be required to do sort of the same kinds of things as a graduate student did with regards to breadth as you did as an undergrad. That's not to say that you are required to take all of the classes that you'll take as a graduate student within your particular discipline. Many things today are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and you will gain strength and value by bringing things from different fields together in new and interesting ways. But overall, you won't be taking the wide swath of classes that you took as an undergrad, particularly in your first and second year.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Kimberly. As a full-time employee in the field of healthcare, looking at the EMHA, I think that's the Executive Masters of Healthcare Administration program, is a GA an option for a TA position? So in terms of some of the roles with being a GA here at UNLV, when you're a graduate assistant, you can only work an additional 10 hours outside of your assistantship with another organization, whether that's on campus or off campus. So if you were planning on keeping your full-time position, then you would not be able to also be a graduate assistant. I think there are other ways in terms of like being a part-time instructor to do that, but I'm not exactly sure the rules around that are. I don't know, Dr. Hansen, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do. So I mentioned that my bachelor's degree is in nursing and that I worked as an operating room nurse before I went back to school and got into geology. And I was working at a major trauma center in San Diego. And as an operating room nurse, the operating room has to be staffed 24/7, whether there are cases going on or not. So for several years, while I was taking all of the undergrad required classes for the geology majors at UNLV, or at San Diego State, I was working nearly full time. But I worked 12-hour shifts every Saturday and Sunday from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then I'd work an evening shift from 3 to 11 p.m., which you can do and have that kind of flexibility when you work in a hospital, which is one of the great things about that career path is you have lots of flexibility when you work. But by doing that, it freed up Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 for most days. And so I was able to take my classes during the week when classes are typically being taught. So I didn't have a GA when I was doing that because I made more money as a practicing professional in the operating room than I would have if I had been a GA. However, in my last year of my master's degree at San Diego State, I chose to stop working so that I could accept a GA, even though it was much less financial support. But I did it because I knew I was going to go on to a PhD program, and I wanted to have the experience of teaching a lab so that when I was applying to that graduate program, I could talk about the experience of leading a lab and being successful at that. So it's always a personal decision, and there are different things to consider, different factors to consider. Given what the student asked about, my sense is that you probably are going to be much better off financially if you keep working outside of UNLV, but just keep in mind that there's certain advantages that you would get by being a GA, at least for part of your time as a graduate student.
And just to add one more thing to that, just because of the program you mentioned, the Executive Masters of Healthcare Administration, I do believe that the way that program is set up is for working professionals. So the courses are typically, I believe, in the evenings. So if you wanted to keep your full-time job, like if you're a hospital administrator already, then you would be able to do after work classes and things like that. But it's something that I would recommend you reach out to the grad coordinator for that program for, just to look at your options. So our next question here is, I think, for our ambassadors again, and it says, are you an RA or a TA? And if so, what is it like? What's the difference between them? What makes them unique? Did you have a preference? Andrea, did you want to start with this question?
Sure. So presently I'm a GA, but I have been both an RA and TA in the past. And the biggest difference was for TA, I was basically in charge of discussion sections, grading papers, office hours, sort of trying out what it's like to be a professor eventually. And I would say that I had a lot of more flexible time because I could grade papers on my own time as opposed to having to have, something scheduled between the standard business hours. And then for being a research assistant, that was funded through my lab. And I was basically getting paid to what I was already supposed to be doing, which is sort of what Dr. Hansen was mentioning. So that was very convenient I was just collecting data and participating on things that would get me ahead in my research projects without having to balance teaching and that on the other side.
Thank you, Andrea. And Joseph?
Right. So I'm actually neither an RA or a TA, so I'm just a graduate assistant. I'm helping the event coordinator for career services. I'm helping out to plan and host the career fair. So I think Dr. Anderson actually went through pretty elaborately that the graduate assistantships are all unique in the sense where you don't have to necessarily get one in your department. So depending on the assistantship, you can know that the role is a TA, and if you're comfortable with doing discussion like Andrea mentioned, or teaching or taking over 1 or 2 class times. And like for myself, I'm actually in working department of UNLV, so helping out in event planning and being administrator for our career launch platform. So a lot of options are open for you if you do decide to pursue becoming a graduate assistant.
That's a great
So I
point,
would-
Joseph,
Oh,
and I want to
go
add
ahead.
I want to add a comment to that. So in your discipline in hospitality, lots of career planning stuff happens. So even though you're not a TA or an RA, you're being funded on an assistantship to do something that has at least some likelihood that it's going to benefit you when you get into your professional career. And I mention that because the graduate college, at least in my experience, tries to avoid having students doing sort of meaningless tasks that don't have any connection to what their future career plans are.
Definitely. And just to add on to that, to clarify for everyone here, so there's basically different types of GAs. So we have the traditional, the research assistant, teaching assistant, but then you have these more of administrative or professional development graduate assistant positions where there's departments that are not academic units that offer graduate assistantship. So for example, within the graduate college, we have a variety of different assistantships, and we're not necessarily an academic college where someone would be, a teaching assistant within the graduate college. So that's also an option. Maybe sometimes when you're applying for a program and maybe they don't do funding within that academic unit, but you can also get a GA with an administrative unit and they'll still give you a stipend and still give you tuition reimbursement and waive your tuition. So that's always an option as well. So our next question here is it better to gain professional work experience for a couple of years before applying to graduate programs? And what are the benefits and disadvantages of starting a program immediately after your undergraduate career?
I can go ahead and share my experience for my classes right now. So I'm taking both hospitality and MIS classes. And I think we're in a situation as of now because of the COVID situation where a lot of students who graduated their undergrad program jump straight to the graduate program. And so obviously there are pros and cons because you're very familiar with the classroom settings, the class work. But then again, for a graduate program, we're talking about real life situation, cases, and your experiences in the workforce, in the industry. And obviously, when there are class discussions, if you don't have at least a little bit of experience, it's kind of difficult to share your inside knowledge coming from your background as with working experience. So I think that's like the biggest disadvantage. And obviously, on the other hand, if you have work experiences, it will be great to share your knowledge with your classmate of your experience, good and bad, and what the students can look forward to in the future, and you know, work on the necessary skill sets and gain the necessary knowledge to help them be successful once they graduate.
Andrea, did you have anything?
Yeah, so I would say for me, the reason I chose to go to grad school was to, become an academic, but also to enter the mental health field. And so for me, it did not really make a whole lot of sense to go out in the community and get professional experience. For one, I wouldn't have been able to do it in my field because you need at least a master's level to be an entry-level position. So these are just things to consider and being informed about what path it is that you want to choose, because there are different education requirements and that might influence your decision.
And I have a couple of things I'll add. So, I think the decision of whether to go into the workforce or go on to graduate school is always going to be a personal one. If you're not sure about what it is you want to specialize in by going to graduate school, then I would advocate not necessarily going on that path. You want to have a pretty clear idea that, like, this is a good idea for me, and this will enhance my career path overall, and it's something I really care about and I want to do. If you don't feel that way, then I would say, maybe it makes sense to go into the workforce. Sometimes getting a job is a great thing to help you figure out what you like and don't like. So if you're not certain that graduate school is the right thing for you, in some cases, maybe you're better off not going to graduate school. But having said that, you also want to be careful, because if you choose to go into the workforce and then later come back into academia to get a graduate degree, that transition from being a well-paid, hopefully working professional, to going back to being a poor, starving student is a challenging one. But if you know that transition makes sense, because ultimately it's going to take you to where you really want to go, then you'll do it, and you'll find a way to be that poor, starving student again, and not. You'll stop going out for food as often as you do. You'll stop going to concerts. You'll stop buying music. You'll stop doing certain things that you have the luxury of doing when you're being paid. But you'll find a way to make it work. It really just depends on what your personal situation is. And if you know you want to go to graduate school, you'll find a way to make that work. If you're not sure and you go into the workforce, or if you know that grad school isn't for you and you're just going to go into the workforce, like, there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what works for you, if that's what makes sense for you, follow your path.
Thank you. And just to add on, there's always those unique situations with every program. So for example, if you're interested in going into, let's say, getting your master's of business administration, it would actually be to your advantage to have gotten some work experience and have had that professional experience when you were actually applying. So it just kind of varies on the program, the path that you want to go into, just like everyone here mentioned. So our next question is, are master's students eligible for TA positions, and does it vary by program?
I'll take a first stab at this. So the answer to the first question is absolutely. There are TAs available for master's students, and there are certain universities where they maybe don't have PhD programs, but they have master's degrees. If they have funding, they will make that funding available to students in those master's programs. But that's just one example. It doesn't mean that if a university offers PhDs that you won't get a TA for a master's. But in those situations, and I'll speak specifically about UNLV in my home department, because UNLV had been making this push for many years to achieve Carnegie R1 status, which means we're research intensive. A key metric in that designation is how many PhD students are you graduating each year? And because UNLV was striving to get that high research designation, priority in departments was if you had a choice between funding a PhD student versus funding a master's student, the tendency and the likelihood is that the PhD student would be more likely to get the funding offered than the master's student, because then that funding is helping the university achieve some other goal that's outside of anything that's happening in the department. But that's not to say that there are so like in my home department, there are assistantships given to both PhD students and master students. It does, it just is a matter of like who's in the pool and what sort of funding is available, and it doesn't. If there's a preference and an option, you would probably offer the funding to a PhD student over a master student, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for a master student also.
Thank you. So this is a really great question. How difficult is the transition for a student trying to get into a graduate program that's completely different than their undergraduate program? What are some things that could help ease that transition?
I feel like this question has my name on it, given my background and my path. But if either of our students want to chime in, that would be great too. So like, as I said, my bachelor's degree was in nursing. I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do. I realized that geology was something I was completely fascinated with and interested in. And at the time I discovered that, I had already made the decision that I really enjoyed teaching and I wanted to teach as my career. But I also knew that I didn't want to teach K through 12. I wanted to teach adults. And so if I was going to pursue that first and fundamental passion of mine, I knew I was going to need a PhD to be able to teach adults at a university level. So, so in my case, I thought it was completely improbable that any PhD program would admit me if I didn't have some sort of degree in geology. That just didn't seem like it would work. So I chose to go back to school and I took all of the required major classes for a geology major, and then stayed and did a master's thesis at the same school. That clearly got me into the PhD program that I went into, and so that path worked. Once I got to my PhD program, though, I had a classmate who had done an undergraduate degree in Asian languages and had studied abroad in China, and then went to work for a nonprofit in Boston, which is where they lived at the time. And while they were working at this nonprofit, they too took a geology class and discovered that, like, hey, this is really cool. This is what I want to do. And in that particular, and in my classmates' scenario, she ended up taking classes from incredibly well-known faculty members at both Harvard and MIT. And so she applied to the PhD program and was accepted, even though she didn't get a second degree. So she had a bachelor's degree in Asian languages, had taken core classes from well-known people, and applied to a geology PhD program without a single geology degree. And in her case, that worked. But I think and so the answer is that it varies. But I think if you're going to switch into something entirely different, and so like going from nursing to geology, or Asian languages into geology, you're gonna want to have some fundamental understanding of the discipline that you're headed into. It's not to say that you can't succeed, but the challenge will be significantly greater if you don't have some of the core undergraduate foundational content knowledge.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. So for another question for Joseph and Andrea, what are some skills that you have found that you had prior to beginning grad school that really helped you now as a graduate student?
So I would say time management and being organized have really helped me with graduate school. Whereas in undergrad, I felt that it was easier to check off things off your list. Like, oh, I've studied for this class or this test. And grad school is this big race, I guess you would call it, of like there's always something going and projects may last several years. So you really gotta have organization of when to prioritize things so that your supervisor can look at them and you can keep going with other things and just, keep things manageable, because it can get pretty out of hand if you're not, keeping those things in check.
Thank you. Joseph?
Yeah, I do agree with Andrea that time management, it is crucial. And I think to add on to that, I think communication skills is crucial as well. So coming from abroad, it's a whole different country and different culture and stuff, and being able to communicate, I think it's very important. So in grad school, you have a lot of projects and a lot of group work. So being able to communicate well with your group members and also your professors, and I think that would definitely help you succeed in finishing your grad school, and obviously also help you in your career as well.
Thank you. Anything to add, Dr. Hansen?
I don't think so. These guys articulated key things that came to my mind.
Thank you. I want to see if anyone else has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. We have 3 great panelists here today that can help you figure out things that you might be thinking about as you starting your journey to apply for graduate school or to succeed once you get in.
All right, well, if nobody has any further questions, I'm going to take this chance to say thank you for attending today. I hope this was useful to you. I hope you learned, I hope you got all the questions you had about graduate school and navigating that transition answered. If not, clearly there are people here at UNLV who care and want you to succeed in the path that you're trying to follow. So if there's any further questions, I know Nevena is probably willing to serve as a key contact, and then she can funnel those things out to whoever's appropriate if you have follow-up questions. Thank you all for coming today, and with that, I'll turn it back to Nevena to say any concluding things, or to Andrea or Joseph if they have things.
Thank you so much. And as always, before we end, we just want to thank our presenters, our panelists for giving your time, your expertise, and sharing this really important information with our attendees. I'm going to go ahead and add a link to the chat for everyone to please take a couple of minutes and give us feedback on the workshop. And if you have any other questions, please reach out to us at the Grad Academy at unlv.edu. We'll be happy to answer any of those for you. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.